Welcome to Space Matters, the Space Governance Podcast, where the Australasian Centre for Space Governance invites experts from across the Asia-Pacific region and around the world to discuss with us the most pressing issues of space governance, policy, and law. We acknowledge that many members of the ACSG live and work on Indigenous country. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations as knowledge holders of responsible governance of lands, waters, and skies. Hi, and welcome to this episode of Space Matters, which is the second in a two-part series about the WRegSAT workshops, which are the workshops on the regulation of space activities and technologies. This is a groundbreaking multi-year project under the umbrella of the Australasian Centre for Space Governance in partnership with the University of New South Wales and with Gilbert and Tobin. And what we do across the course of this multi-year project is we hold a series of workshops each year, 3 per year. And these conversations that you're about to listen to were recorded during the first workshop of the second series. In other words, year 2, 2026 was the first time we came together in person in Canberra. And we have people from across industry, people who work on biotech and regulation of more cyber-oriented technologies. We have practicing lawyers, we have academics, we have Indigenous scholars, and what's really enjoyable actually is the mutual learning and exchange that goes on. There's also multi-generational learning. There are some people who've been in the space industry in Australia for several decades and some who are just emerging experts and scholars. So there's mutual learning as we enter into the discussions about the topics, and there's also the intention to work towards a regulatory options paper at the end of each series. So now in episode 2, we have more of the conversations that I recorded with some of our experts and participants on the sidelines of the workshop. And first up is Matthew Stubbs, who is a professor at the University of Adelaide, which is now merged with the University of South Australia. He's a professor in international law, military law, and also space law. And so he and I had a discussion about space law and military law, the intersections. Some of that is quite challenging when we're talking about all of the different types of regulation that cover Australian space activities. Sometimes we try and carve out whether the security issues are actually dealt with quite separately, and sometimes we have to look at the intersections and overlaps. So Matthew and I had a really interesting chat about that. How are you finding it?
Oh, really exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not too much of a brain drain?
I mean, I think it's a really good opportunity to think about how we regulate space and why we do it, and having a mixture of, lawyers and practitioners and in the room is a really interesting way of testing what actually matters in practice and the way in which the regime that we have, or the regime we choose to construct, or to what we choose not to regulate, impacts on the real world.
And Matthew, have you ever practiced law? I've never.
For about 5 minutes. So I was admitted I practiced for a bit. I have a very small continuing practice, but my main focus is academic.
Yeah. What's the practice area?
Military law.
Yep. And that's what you do in academia as well. And did you come from military law to space law, or from space law to military law?
I suppose I got into them both around the same time. So there's, I suppose, a relationship in the sense that I'm interested in the strategic aspects of space.
We don't sort of touch on that a lot here. So national security is definitely one of our kind of framework values or questions. One of the things we have to keep in mind when we're talking about the risks and the impacts. But we're not really talking about space security as such very much. Do you think we need to do more of that, or do we end up being then too, do we go down a bit of a wormhole of NatSec?
Yeah, I think actually probably we've got the balance about right, which is to say that we don't do very much national security at all. And I think there are probably 2 good reasons for that, in that this project is really focused on the domestic. And so I think there's an argument in the space context that just as in the air context, it will be more effective if we try and regulate what is done in the commercial sector and recognise that states will be much more reluctant to regulate what's going to be done in national security context by military and other state entities. And so I think that's one reason not to worry so much about the strategic. The other thing is that the strategic would force us really to think about international law. and to force us to think about sort of multilateral actions. And they're really important topics, but they don't necessarily speak directly to the question of what Australia should be regulating and why Australia should be regulating it. So a lot of the things that Australia's strategic national interests in space are really important, but might actually be entirely different to the question of what should Australia require a licence for an Australian company to do in space.
Yeah, exactly. And so, because we keep coming back to the question, why are we doing space? Why does Australia do space? Who are we regulating? Because I think we're trying to use that to keep us in scope constantly, but to think about national security is one of the reasons we do space. But why do you think we should? Why should Australia do space, and why should we regulate that?
So I think why should we do space? We are already doing space. We're completely invested already in space. We're totally dependent on space for any number of things that we do in our everyday life. So, it's not really a question of should we do space. We're kind of totally beyond that and totally in it up to our eyeballs. I suppose the question is, where do we draw the bounds around what we should regulate in space? That civil military distinction is probably a helpful way of thinking about it, but I think also it's the question of, there's no reason to regulate what Australians do just for the sake of it. There has to be a reason for us to say, well, we think we should regulate for X reason or Y reason. And so there are lots of times when Australia's national interest might be brought about. Sometimes that's because we might bear international responsibility for what's done by Australian entities, or there might be liability consequences for what's done by Australian entities, and that's a good reason to regulate if we think that individuals might expose Australia to liability. But I think also there's that question of, we want to foster opportunities for Australian business, and sometimes regulation actually is a way of doing that. It's a way of providing certainty that will enable business and enable investment. And so you can say, okay, well, there's going to be regulation, we're going to control how this is done. That can actually create a level playing field. It can actually bring multilateral prospects back into Australia. And so I think it's not just about the downside of regulating risk to Australia. It's also about trying to create the conditions in which Australian space industry can thrive.
Yeah, and that's it's come up a few times, hasn't it? We know that there are some commercial actors who say regulation stifles innovation and makes it harder for Australia to compete, but actually, unless you have regulatory clarity, it's really hard to get investors, it's really hard to get your project up, it's really hard to get clients and contracts. And so I guess, and it has come up a couple of times that we've said we want Australia to be contributing to shaping norms, shaping a responsible and custodian approach to space, but at the same time we don't want to create extra burdens that might prevent companies wanting to come here, or might end up with forum shopping. Do you think that is it such a fine line to tread?
Look, I think it's always difficult, but I think that if we think about a long-term perspective, we haven't set up corporate entities in a way that requires them to think about the long term. We've set them up in a way that requires them by law to think about the return to shareholders right now.
Yeah.
And so there is a role for government to say, okay, well, we're not planning for what happens next year. We want Australian companies to succeed. We want Australians to be able to leverage all the benefits of space, from fighting bushfires to going to the bank. But we need to know that we'll be able to do that in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. There's an intergenerational question here. Yeah. And corporate entities aren't set up to do that. They're not set up to say, is it right that we do this now, and what will the impact be in 50 years' time? That is a job for government to think about. Do we encourage industry in particular ways? Do we have a set of guidelines or constraints on what we allow, with a view to how this shapes the future?
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's awesome. I am so grateful that you keep us on track with scope. Like I said, I've taken that on as a self-mandate, but you are really good at keeping us back on track, because we are also interested in so many other topics, and every single one of the topics could be a 10-year PhD thesis.
And that's the wonderful thing about space.
Yeah.
Right? There's so much exciting stuff going on in so many different ways. And my work really is more focused on the international than it is on the domestic generally. Yeah. But you've got to be realistic about what a project can achieve, and this is a fantastic project that a group of really great people But we need to make sure that what we try and do is something that's small enough that we can actually make a contribution, that we can say by the time we get to the end of the year, hey, we've looked at these issues, we've identified, all of the things that are, big ticket items in terms of how we should think about that, and we've got a set of options that are actually useful about what government might want to do. Yeah. And you can't do that with 10 people and a small amount of money for everything. You have to be focused on what's the topic this year, and then what is a great topic for another time.
Yeah, exactly. And what's a great topic for academics to take care of that won't even be in one of our series, exactly. And I think also in terms of, I use the term middle power. Not everyone vibes with that for Australia, but our budget's limited, our capacity is limited. The kinds of issues Australians think are important, we need to make sure it's tying into that, not just the industry, but like you said, can we fight bushfires? Can we use the bank? Rather than can we necessarily do human spaceflight? And so we have to make choices. I think Japan actually does almost end to end, but I think Japan has built that by choosing along the way, bit by bit, which bits it's going to lean into. Canada's done an outstanding job, New Zealand as well, of saying we can't do everything, which bits are we going to lean into and make our exceptional contribution, and then regulate for that and create an environment to support that. And so I think there's a contribution we can make too to kind of clarifying what are the bits that we really need to focus on. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Australia is not a big superpower, and we shouldn't think that we will be able to drive the way international law regulates the kind of the United States or Russia or China. But we should think that we can partner with other institutions and other countries, and I think there's a lot of value in thinking about strategic partnerships. And we should also think that, we need to focus. We can't do everything. We're not going to be the space power that does everything. But there's lots of areas where if we put the thought and the support into it, we can do it right. And that focus is really important. That was the story of the Space Activities Act. It was an act in Australia written for the launch of 3 enormous satellites that we thought was going to happen, and it didn't happen. Right? Australia didn't end up being the place from which the enormous satellites were launched. And because the Act had been written with that in mind, it was an Act that totally squashed the prospect of doing much more innovative and smaller things. And that was obviously the motivation behind the change to the Space Launches and Returns Act. But that idea is we've got to have a realistic focus on what can Australia do, what is our niche in the world in all of this, and then regulate for that. Act in a way that supports what we want to do, rather than trying to say we can do everything.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for keeping us on track. Okay, so this next conversation was a 3-way conversation, which I really, really enjoyed because we were delving into some rather unusual interdisciplinary questions. So Dr. Rebecca Allen is the co-director of the Space Technology and Industry Institute at Swinburne University of Technologies. She has an astrophysics background. She deals with a lot of different research in space technology and how to translate that into industry and how to partner with industry. And the other person we were speaking to is Dr. Evie Kendal, who is an ethicist, a biotech ethicist, sometimes a space ethicist, sometimes a technology ethicist in general. She helped us identify really what is meant by ethics in technology areas because it often very much depends on the types of technologies. But between the three of us, we had a really interesting dive into the value of interdisciplinary participation in something where we're looking at regulation. They're not lawyers, but their input is extremely valuable. 2 awesome women, Evie Kendal and Rebecca Allen. It's the first time I'm meeting both of you in person, so I'm quite excited. And it's really great to have 2 non-lawyers in the room for WRegSAT. So Evie, tell us who you are and what you do.
So I'm Evie Kendal. I'm the head of the Ethical, Legal and Social Implications of Emerging Technologies Research Group at the Ivison Health Innovation Research Institute at Swinburne University of Technology.
Oh my goodness, does that have an acronym or not?
No, it doesn't, surprisingly. We say LCIT for the first part, but the Ivison we just call the Ivison.
Amazing. And you're you're not just a space ethicist, you're a technology ethicist.
Yes, so I used to describe myself as an emerging technology ethicist, and then the media team made it sound like that's like I'm emerging, and they're like, at this point you've emerged. So I now have to say ethicist of emerging technology to clarify.
But emerging technologies, like you said it today during our conversation, can be anything and everything. So how do you, if you're speaking to the media and they say, tell us about AI, tell us about, and the example you gave of AI could be artificial intelligence or artificial insemination. Do you have to kind of brief yourself on or are there overlapping themes in all of these technology areas?
Well, thank the goddess there are overlapping themes, otherwise I'd really struggle. But usually I'm just very humble and I have to learn from the experts. So you have to always recognize you're not the expert in the room when you're doing something that is essentially the work of a generalist rather than a specialist. So you just have to really keep hold of that humility and make sure that you are listening to the experts and getting briefed by the right people. And then you just have to contextualize what you're saying. You find things that are in common, you find analogies, and you use the sort of modular frameworks that we have in ethics. What is the most salient point about this piece of new tech? What is it similar to? What is it different to? And then try and build your frameworks from there.
Mm-hmm. And that is very different, I think, Rebecca, for you, because you are specialist rather than generalist. Tell us about what you do.
Well, now that we've just said that, I am a trained astronomer who, as much as I love looking at very distant galaxies, I felt like there's actually more impact to translate a lot of that knowledge for technology and capability that can help Earth. So, for example, looking at distant galaxies, we use a tool called photometry, which is basically like you take any image, in those pixels there's information. So I became an expert at extracting the information of galaxies out of images. Well, if we look at Earth observation, instead of looking up at space, we're looking down at the ground, and that information is just as important, if not more important, for helping us. So my role has then been to step into the Space Technology and Industry Institute as the co-director, and using my understanding of space and astrophysics and space technology, but then also trying to navigate and understand where there's opportunities for Australia and the region, and then help direct and guide research translation in key areas.
And can you say a bit more about research translation? Because that's a term we use in academia, but I don't think it's always clear what that means, particularly if we're talking about like all these different space technologies, or some of them are not necessarily space technologies but have applications. So what does research translation mean?
Yeah. So when we say translation, a lot of times when people think of researchers, we think of like pure research. So this person is studying this species of frog to see if perhaps they secrete some toxin that can make us more beautiful, right? And actually that's kind of research translation. But when we say translation, you're taking what we would consider pure research. So just can I do this? Does this exist? Is this possible? Big questions. And it can be, and the reason I'm being more vague is because to me it really covers engineering and science. So for example, in science, in astronomy, we are often looking for things which behave very quickly in our universe. So we have to design pipelines to capture images of exploding stars, and these explosions may happen on a millisecond time scale. So we want to try to take that image, detect that object, and then ping astronomers because there's simply too much information there. We can't save that whole image, essentially. We want to just save the information we care about, and we don't want to lose an important result. Well, do you know what also moves through the sky very quickly and tends to annoy astronomers is satellites and space debris, also asteroids. So looking at this whole pipeline that was basically designed to only find the things we want, the exploding stars, and get rid of the rest, well, actually, that pipeline is very useful for then discovering satellites and debris glints and using these telescopes which take in vast swaths of the night sky to be able to actually help us monitor that space around Earth that we really care about. So that's an example of translation, because you're taking something which was designed to help us with one specific type of discovery, but then we've realized that it actually is very important for building capability in an area which we think is really important, which is protecting our planet and monitoring our skies.
Yeah. That's awesome. So I was actually quite incorrect in saying, well, you're more specialist because your expertise is to translate
some things.
So indeed, both of you have actually really broad expertise. And here you are in a room full of lawyers and at a workshop to talk about the regulation of space activities. So I guess I have two questions. One is, why are you here? Why like, we need you in the room, but what made you want to be in the room? And is it what you thought it would be so far? I'll go to you, Rebecca.
Yeah, sure. It works two ways for me. So as a scientist, especially, astronomy background, we think about what are the big questions we want to answer. And then we work backwards and say, well, what is the space technology? So it could be space telescope or International Space Station, mission to the moon. What does it take? What's it going to take for us to get that information to answer that question? So the regulatory aspect comes in there because it's how do we do those things, especially being in Australia and needing to access space from other countries and collaborate and trying to understand even to the samples what we're sending to space. What areas does that touch? Because your science will die very quickly if you break laws and you have to pay lots of money or you end up in jail for a long time. So it's about practicing things and staying within the laws and understanding those regulations, how we operate in space. The other side of it is when you are in the kind of discovery, technology development side, and for example, we talk a lot about AI, you see the potential for things to do a lot of harm. Mm-hmm. And so, or be misused, or, concerns if they aren't properly used. And so I feel like that's a point where we can really say, okay, well, we helped design these things. Let us tell you where we really believe that they could, be dangerous or, even potentially help us with some risk, address some risk. So it kind of comes in both sides.
Yeah. That's the perfect segue to you then.
Yeah, so a lot of people would say the law tells you what's right and wrong, but it doesn't. It tells you what's allowed and not allowed, or what we haven't thought to put any rules around in the first place. Mm-hmm. And ethics and morality is what tells you what's right and wrong. And essentially, our laws are supposed to reflect our social values, and our social values come from our philosophy, from our values. And what we're looking at in terms of regulation is not just what's legally required. These are ethico-legal problems. So always having ethics at the heart of what we're discussing when we're saying what are we going to allow and what are we not going to allow. It should come back to what are our social values, what beliefs do we have as a society, what do we think is right and wrong, and within that, what do we think we can impose on others in terms of what the majority might think is the right thing to do? Does that mean that we actually want to make a rule about it? Mm-hmm. So classic examples, historically, it may have been against the law to commit adultery, for example, and now we say, well, a lot of people still don't think it's the right thing to do, but we don't feel like we should have a law against it. So that's when it separates out again. So the law is supposed to reflect those values, and those values change over time. So the law has to change as well. So I'm interested in technologies being released into the world and sort of integrated into society after we've had the ethical-legal discussion, not before. And law is quite reactionary. It looks at, okay, we've released something into the world and something went wrong, so now there's liability, now we have to pay compensation, now we have to put rules in place. Whereas ethics is going to be more proactive. It'll be, this is a new technology, it's similar to what we've done before in this way. We have socially tolerated and accepted this technology, which is similar in these important ways, and therefore we can structure guidelines around the tech before we release it into the world. And that helps minimizing that risk and litigation as well.
Yeah, and that's a really nice, we've been having a lot of discussions with Dean Sanders' input around trying to give a framework that has to do with custodianship and thinking of the next 7 generations, which is very hard with these complex technologies because we don't really know what's coming down the line, but to think about exactly like a sense of responsibility and that the right and the wrong. So my last question to you both is, that second question I'd asked you, is it what you expected so far after the end of day 1?
Yeah, I think so. I think people are very much discussing the topics that I would expect. And I think what's really important is noting where Australia has expertise that's particularly valuable to template for the international community. So things like the resource extraction, we of course have quite a long heritage of that. And even in terms of respecting different titles and respecting different knowledges, we are getting better at that in Australia. It is something that a lot of people are focused on. And if we can template that for the rest of the world, I think that's a major strength for Australia. I think policy and ethics has always been the space that we could actually occupy in this industry.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to build off what Evie said there in the previous point, in that, in Dean's comments as well, is that space belongs to all of us. And, we've seen the ramp up of satellites and space activity, which has happened over the past few years. And so we do need to adapt. We need to modify. And we have the ability, because it's more of a global community now. It's not just one or two giant state actors, to really weigh in and give our opinion and support what the UN is saying as well, and back that up with actions. But how do we do that? Because each state is in charge of its own kind of governance, and so we have to look at where we can govern and where we can influence. And so I think that's what's been really beneficial for me, is just understanding the landscape and priorities, and hearing some of it in some of the kind of legal jargon and regulatory jargon, to help understand, well, how do we have these conversations as people who want to influence these things, and to do it in a way which is effective and impactful and allows us to achieve our ambitions in space activity. But then also it's an opportunity, like with First Nations, like it's a no-brainer to me that we should be absolutely considering our impacts, because we've already seen how the runaway effect can happen, and this is a point where we actually have the power to do that in step with ethics, with things. And some would argue too late, but I would argue it's this is the time and where we have a really important role to play.
Yeah, the best time to do it was earlier. The next best time is now. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, it's so great having you both in the rooms.
Can we ask you a question?
Yes.
What value do you see for interdisciplinarity for this kind of project?
Oh my God, it can't be done if it's just a bunch of lawyers talking to a bunch of lawyers. That's an impossibility and ridiculous. So lessons learned from Duncan Blake, whose brainchild this whole project was also the initiator of what ended up being 2 manuals on space law and the laws of armed conflict and use of force, and how those different regimes interact with each other. And if you just had lawyers in the room, we started making stuff up.
Yeah.
Oh, you can use any satellite as a weapon. You can just ram it into another satellite. And then the astrophysicists would go, actually, that doesn't. So we needed technical experts in the room. We needed operational people who do military space operations. We needed lawyers of different ilk and different nationalities. And then we need input from states as well. And similarly with this, if we're talking about providing guidance to the Australian regulators about whenever they intersect with space activities, if you just have lawyers talking to lawyers, we've already seen, like, the Australian space sector, the industry is very frustrated because there's a lack of clarity often. Some of the regulations and those lawyers deciding about permits early on had zero understanding of what the technologies were. You've already piped in a couple of times today, Rebecca, when we've said, well, Australia's not doing anything with this, and you've gone, actually, we're doing some really cool stuff. And similarly, bringing in an ethics lens, I think, keeping us on track, because otherwise we're just talking in our own bubbles. Interdisciplinary work is important, full stop. But I think if we're going to say anything meaningful about these really complex technologies in an environment that is, unique in its own physical properties and complexities, adding in the geopolitical dimensions and so on and so forth, having Dean and Amos here with to really guide us. So we keep saying we want to bring in Indigenous perspectives. Having their voices in the room is an imperative. So yeah. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. That's great. So the last conversation that I recorded on day 2, and in fact the last conversation that we are including as part of this 2-part mini-series about the WRegSAT workshops, is with an Indigenous scholar, Amos Taylor. It's such a delight speaking with Amos because he just individually has a very different perspective on things. He's a law student at UNSW, Law and Justice. Some of what he does is very much based on a mission to protect Indigenous rights and interests with evolving legal landscapes in aviation and space law. Some of it is about challenging colonial perspectives. Some of it is, I guess you could say, about applying the black letter law, the positivist law, straight up and down, but then questioning the context in which those laws arise and how they're applied. We spoke a lot about Sky Country, which is a realm that's deeply rooted in Aboriginal knowledge systems. Amos is very clear that he's not a knowledge holder, he's not an elder, but he does a great job of really making clear for people why Sky Country is so important. Sky Country and country that we see on the ground, land and waters, are all part of one system and reflect our activities. And so we have an opportunity and also an obligation to really take care of Sky Country. I really, really enjoyed this conversation with Amos, and I think it's a fantastic note to finish this mini-series, two-part mini-series on RegSAT, because we cover so many different legal and social and technological issues throughout RegSAT. And Amos has a really great way of just putting everything together in one big package. So please do enjoy this conversation between Amos and myself. Hey, Amos. It's so nice to meet you in person. I'd heard loads of you from another colleague, Art. I heard loads about you and your work. And it's been really cool to kind of hear your interjections now and then about time, for example. Well, let's talk about what you said, like your ancestral mandate. You said like it's kind of been handed to you and it's unfolding now for you. What is that ancestral mandate?
Yeah, I think it started as the idea, or I guess I even describe it as the words hitting my ears, and then it was a rap usually, or like the click of the universe clicking in place. And then I guess across time it's sort of accepting or seeing signs that point to that being like a cultural obligation or like an ancestral mandate. So it started off as like a bit of a manifesto to try to determine like what a career in maybe space law would look like. And then the ancestral mandate has basically shaped that over 3 years and pointed to like gaps in air law and sort of Sky Country being sort of everything above the treetops, which sort of includes air law and space law.
Yeah. So let's pause there for a moment because, you know, as you pointed out in your presentation, like space lawyers often like to talk about the fact there's no official delineation in international law as to where sovereign airspace ends and outer space begins, and yet outer space is beyond national jurisdiction. And we get into like, you know, we get ourselves into nice little knots about it. But then you said Sky Country is everything above the treetops. And so maybe there is or could be or should be a merge between those two and the technologies. So yeah, say a bit more about that for us.
Yeah, I think most people don't really consider looking up or would consider sort of Sky Country as being a part of sort of the national interests. Like a lot of the time they're still trying to claim back lands and waters. So sky's not really within people's minds, but like everything else, all of Sky Country is fragmented and split off and zoned, essentially. And so that in itself is difficult to protect, I guess, in terms of Indigenous rights and interests, because it spans across so much. So it could be from where we're breathing, or as I say, above the treetops, because it's a little bit more understandable to visualize. Perhaps like Mob would be in the trees and just beyond their reach is where Sky Country would begin. But you're sort of talking about the lower airspace, which is sort of the airspace that is included in your rights to land. Mm-hmm. And that sort of is a grey area where that mixes into, say, where aviation takes over, which is sort of public safety and planes and helicopters in the sky. And then that sort of transitions into like where defence is, and people argue that there's no real demarcation between air law and space law because they want defence to go about their business without sort of breaching any sort of obligations or sort of treaties. And so then, it leads up into space in terms of where defence is, or now, I guess, with Elon's self-landing rockets, industry is now sort of looking into the progression into space. So Sky Country just covers so much, but really, when I spoke to a friend of mine, an academic at UNSW who wrote about some air rights, in I think her PhD, we spoke about like the breath or the air that we expel. Like a lot of the academic jurisprudence has been written by mob or like women, so like women, black academics, and then as you progress higher into the atmosphere, it sort of goes from feminist jurisprudence and sort of black jurisprudence into just men owning everything. So aviation is first, so men own aviation, and then defence is above that, where men own that. So you can even see the progression of power from where we breathe up into the sky, which is also interesting when you consider that no one's thinking about it, because I guess you could argue that the white men are in power there and no one's coming for that.
Yeah. It's invisible. They're quite happy for it to remain invisible. Or at least out of mind, out of sight, out of mind. Because there's a kind of increasing wave of critical theory and literature. A couple of pieces about feminist critique, feminist approaches to space law, feminist approaches to space security, intersectional, and so taking into account different cultural identities as well, and like sexual identities as well, because those same constructs and power dynamics that have oppressed or impacted women have oppressed or impacted other groups. So there's starting to be more of that critical theory. I have also seen some that's like Afrofuturism, so sometimes around science fiction, but like rewriting who has access to the technologies, who's deciding about that access, who's regulating. But I haven't, and there's some Indigenous stuff, like so that piece, Gulwak talking back from country that we talked about and you raised again today. I think that's a really interesting piece. I would love to see more that is talking about this kind of relational approach, and like you said, like the air we breathe just above the treetops, like it's an entirely different conceptual and relational approach versus splitting geography up with lines. Yeah.
Well, often, and you'll find with laws, it's all grey too. Like Australia obviously has sort of marked that space as 100 kilometres, and not many nations do. And then the irony in Katy Perry going to space, when really the US themselves don't even define that as space. So they just went up in like a plane and called themselves an astronaut. So I found that sort of hilarious, that's part of their marketing campaign, when really in like legal speak, they're not even going into space. Yeah.
There was a huge debate, actually. I was teaching a space law and governance course as it was happening real time, when it was Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos having like racing to be the first billionaire to space. And then they had this huge debate because Richard Branson's flight was first, but Jeff Bezos went slightly higher, and they were like, who determines where space is? And like 80% of the world's population says it's here. Like, what? You're just making stuff up to be the first billionaire in space. Caveat: who cares? Like, what are we even talking about here? Like,
and then even when they do, it's like a PR nightmare, because the whole world is just like, what even is this?
Yeah. Well, it's actually really counterproductive, isn't it? Because then people think, and even with the Artemis launch, a lot of people were saying, why are we spending all this money and fuel to launch people into space? I mean, okay, yes, science, okay, yes, that's important, but there's so many things to solve on planet Earth. And when it is the billionaire joy flights, it actually makes our job harder to explain just how much everybody depends on satellites and space-based technologies for their daily lives, and the fact that we are in space, we're impacting space, we're using space, we're already in space, but it kind of makes that a more difficult message to get across because people think of Katy Perry. Like it's,
Yeah. Well, even with the, so going back to what you were speaking about before, you know, through international law, and there's arguments that Indigenous academics make that the UN and the treaties that they created regarding space, the outer space treaties, themselves have Western perspectives that don't include, I guess, true co-design or Indigenous perspectives 100%. Of people being at the table from the beginning. Yeah. And that in itself has restricted, like, first just like no state sovereignty at all, and so sort of once it hits the line outside of where Australia defines its skies, individuals themselves can't access space outside of states. And so there are those, you know, like I spoke to a lawyer in America who is interested in sort of black sort of individual access to space. But it's not enough work that he can do that full time, so that's sort of his side gig. And they've got Black in Astro, and they celebrate Black Space Week, and that's interesting in itself because there is this possible that as individuals we may have access to space, but you know, like a lot of this stuff that's come out of the UN has restricted all of that essentially. And so do they serve us now, or is it again just sort of the colonization of space in that sort of treaty form, and that is restricting and holding everyone back essentially?
And so we're in WRegSAT this year, we're focusing specifically on orbit activities, but of course space activities are not just in space, like talking about the geography of it all. There's also all the ground infrastructure. All of their infrastructure in Australia is very explicitly on country. I mean, as Dean was saying today, it's all on country because it's all Indigenous country. It's all unceded. But the key infrastructure that has been built or is being built is on native title land or is on contested. So it's actually on controversially on Indigenous country. What do you think the space sector in Australia can do or should do to be engaging more with mob or engaging better with mob?
Yeah, I mean there are conversations to be had, like yarns to be had with elders or traditional owners of country and those who are responsible or care for that specific country and perhaps can speak on its behalf. Yeah, I think it just becomes as complex as all the other sort of legal frameworks within Australia, like environmental law is probably a good idea, a good sort of an analogy regarding, like, you know, there's nothing that protects it within the Constitution, and then you're sort of looking at sort of Commonwealth and state separate legislation, and then how that in itself connects with, say, native title, for example. And so then it just becomes really messy, essentially, across all the different states. And I think, although it's a bit outrageous, but I was considering, and although it's contested, and be mindful I'm still a law student too, with no cultural sort of authority, but yeah, perhaps sort of other like local council areas can be defined by country perhaps. So then if you're looking at however many languages which themselves are contested, but just as an example, perhaps sort of the local micro level could be a country or a mob, essentially, and then it grows exponentially. So then you're talking about, okay, what mobs are within that state, and then sort of like, how is that state looking at that? So I think now the lines that we draw, say around like local electives, which essentially is our elections process, like they are balanced on sort of the population of who lives there. But I don't know, if you're looking at it like overall or how you could potentially improve that, like from the very sort of like a redo essentially, yeah, I think maybe you'd start at the lands or the languages of the mob, and then Australia itself has all these councils within states that mob or country can speak from or be represented by. So I mean, that's a bit of a sort of a crazy idea, but that's perhaps like a way that we could address all that complexity essentially.
I mean, I don't think it's that crazy, and clearly I have zero expertise in it, but we were talking a few years ago. I was speaking with Questacon here in Canberra, so the National Science Centre, and CSIRO, and the Australian Space Agency, and we were trying to figure out, like, one of the things I wanted to do was generate a map of Australia which has whatever we can map of different language groups. And I know that mapping is highly political as well, but a map that comes from IATSIC, for example, and then map where the key bits of space infrastructure are on the ground infrastructure, where we have satellite dishes, where we have data management, where we have, defense and civil, and to really kind of show up where that stuff is and show up who the communities are and the traditional owners are in those areas. And then one of the other ideas that we had, all of us, a group of non-Indigenous people, were like, wouldn't it be great if we could hold some kind of conference or workshops where we could be, letting these mobs know about why that infrastructure is there and what it's doing and what the benefits might be, but what the impacts might be. And then very quickly it became evident that we were a group of non-Indigenous people with this idea about, how we should go about giving information to these groups. And so it was this really constant, it's all about relationship building and building trust. But yeah, exactly, maybe what you just described is a really good way to be doing precisely that, so that there can be some exchange and some listening from both sides, right? Rather than going in and saying, we want to come and educate. But at the same time, I think I was telling you, this woman from right up north in Cape York called when I was working at the university, somehow got hold of the Institute of Space and said, this launch company wants to come and set up shop on country here. I don't know anything about what that would mean. They're telling us it's better than mining, but what even is it? What is rocket fuel going to do to country? And so she was actually reaching out for that kind of information. So trying to find those points of contact and
Yeah, I think sort of with the battle with, say, native title, where mob are still trying to claim land back, and that sort of flows into water as well. Many, I guess, communities haven't sort of turned their mind to Sky Country, although we are the world's oldest astronomers, and so it's not like that evidence isn't there, but it's sort of the mindset that they're in now, trying to fight for the rights of where they are currently.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult to, say, bring about infrastructure for space activities, and sort of what that means in terms of their own rights from a sort of true co-design or free, prior, informed consent framework, because those ideas or that infrastructure isn't being generated by that community.
Yeah.
So then you always reach this sort of way where, as you said, non-Indigenous people have ideas and then bring them to the communities. And then you run into this idea of whose idea it is, and if is this just a checkbox that you guys are saying okay for us to come. So I think from the offset, because of the battles that they're currently fighting, that it's tough to turn their minds to the battle for Sky, which eventually will come. Arguability is already here with drones. But yeah, I think the whole thing is just really complex, but I just don't think that's an issue, because I think all of life is complex. And I feel like we just need to, as Australians, lean into our uniqueness and complexity, because it's not like simple legislation now doesn't help regulate complex activities. So it's not like it's without sort of the reach of what academics do now, or even sort of our policymakers. So I think it's just more accepting that, as opposed to thinking it's too hard.
Right, yeah.
Because, it's just complex. Just have an hour conversation as opposed to a 10-minute one.
Yeah. lean into it. And so with that in mind, because that's kind of what we've been grappling with for the last 2 days here at the WRegSAT workshop, is what our number one overarching value is. Ma'abulabu is the term that Dean has given us to think about, what are the intergenerational impacts, the next 7 generations, the 7 generations next, to think about more of a relational approach, like approaching it as a whole rather than looking at specific technologies and activities. And there is an enormous commitment amongst the group, but we're all very much on a learning curve about how that then works as we talk about providing regulatory options and suggestions to the regulator here in Australia. What's your sense of, and I'm not asking for a score out of 10 here, but what's your sense of how the group is grappling with it and working to integrate it? Is it like, are we on a good path? Are you feeling good about it? Are you feeling like it's worthwhile the effort, your involvement in it as well?
Yeah, I think being Indigenous, you see that a lot of the laws don't make sense for you and don't protect you, like criminal law is probably a good example of that. And so I describe that as saying, like, already being outside the matrix, which is sort of like that sci-fi reference of you're able to sort of have the independent thinking, or like you're not just following the usual sort of business as usual. And I think time, or Western time, like labour, like everyone's so focused on work. And even as lawyers, you charge potentially by the hour.
By the 6 minutes.
By the 6 minutes. Yeah. See, I'm not a lawyer yet, so I wouldn't know. And that bleeds into, I think, everything we do, like the cycle of governments and how sort of government departments change. It's just always constantly changing. And so I think to give that idea to non-Indigenous participants or people sort of in the system, like it's hard for them to imagine not designing things outside of 3 years, 5 years. And so if you're saying, think in terms of 7 generations, people often can't do that because to them it just doesn't make sense, like at all. But I think that's like we shouldn't be saying that's too hard basket, like let's not think about that. I think it's ourselves, which again, because I'm interested in science fiction films, is not reliving the Groundhog Day where we're just resetting the day, and sort of like most of those films like Edge of Tomorrow with Tom Cruise and Emily Blunt where they're trying to escape the day. That's what mob feel like when we call it like another day in the colony, because everybody already knows the answer and yet we just relive the same day over and over and over again. And so Uncle Dean sort of giving the challenge of like thinking outside of the time structure, thinking outside of the time loop, that's essentially just trying to set us free of the monotony that we live every day in the colony. So I think, it's a lofty idea and people struggle with it, but to have true sustainability, say in law, you try to implement it in the constitution, so it's sort of outside of the government's power, and Australia said no with that referendum on the voice. And so mob are often just trying to think of ways in which frameworks can be set that are sort of outside of the scope of politics. But again, a lot of people just think that it's too hard, like it's too difficult. Which some of the yarns we had that, people are thinking that's hard to think about 7 generations.
It is, it's a huge leap, and I chatted with Joel about it as well. Because he represents commercial actors, right, whose primary interest is profit for the shareholders, or if they're a startup, making sure the company survives economically. And so their timelines are super short. And I said, but surely their business interest is to keep space usable and accessible so that their business lasts as well, right? So they can keep providing benefits to people and charge money for it because that's the construct they're working in. And he was like, but 7 generations is just too long, like several hundred years. And I was like, but at least if we could start thinking, the very least is like think about mitigating the negative impacts for the future, even if you don't put a time limit on that, and even if you're just asking them to stretch to like 30 or 50 years, like it's step by step, right? We don't have to leap to 7 generations from 5 minutes or 3 years, but what you just said really landed with me, that it's about freeing yourself from Groundhog Day, from another day. Like that's, yeah.
And also, like, why are we in such a rush? Often I don't think that it's about the time sensitive. I think that's a conversation about sort of bureaucracy or like red tape. So perhaps it's not about the fact that you want to launch, and I'm all for innovation and sort of freeing industry to have incredible ideas. I think it's more about certainty for people that apply for things and not being sort of lost in this sort of red tape or black tape or green tape sort of idea where they don't know how long it's going to take. And I feel like that's the delay that people aren't happy with, not specifically that, okay, this process may take a week and they know that for certain what that will look like. So it's like, well, everyone doesn't have to be in a rush. I think just people hate waiting when there's uncertainty.
When they don't know how long it's going to be. Yeah. I think that's right. And I think we have kept coming back to that in our discussions as well, is that, you know, there is a narrative that says overregulation is going to stifle innovation, but actually having clarity is what's going to give everyone it's going to give them the pathway, just knowing.
And plus it also mitigates things, say like, you know, communications with mob or traditional owners, you know, as a true co-design, and say that, you know, that takes the time that it needs to take time, then there's not going to be future implications. There's going to be clarity about that. Yes. You'd hope. Yeah. You know, it's not a perfect world, but you know what I mean? Yeah. So I feel like maybe that mitigates some of the bureaucracy too. Yeah. So, yeah, just interesting.
It's awesome. It's and that's a big takeaway for me as well, is just lean into the complexity. Don't expect it to be simple. What are we on this earth for? What is our journey for? It's not to have already understood everything before we even got here. So go with the... Yeah.
Literally life is so complicated, and I think people just want to have answers and want clarity, and when they want to be happy, when ultimately life is complex, life has ups and downs, no one knows the answers, we're all heroes, we're all villains. So it's just pretending to be outside of this perfect world where everybody knows everything. Like, just lean into it. And I think the one key element that I think people miss is like having fun. And when things are simple, people are bored.
So true.
And when things are a little bit complex, maybe this doesn't apply to like complex board games or something, but people have a better time when it's a little bit crazy, because we're all trying to like solve it ourselves. I myself trying to solve crimes in my old job. Yeah, I think it's just more interesting when there's a puzzle maybe to be unlocked. And it helps when there's lots of people working on it together and collaborating.
Yeah, and having a bit of fun with it too. Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm conscious that sometimes we go, oh yeah, okay, we're talking about, do we say foregrounding or respecting? Amos, what should we say? As if like Amos has to speak on behalf of all Indigenous Australians. And you know, so but don't please don't feel the pressure that you either have to speak or that you have to be in silence. Like, just your presence and the things that you've raised with us is so valuable.
Well, I'm just grateful to be at the table, because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
That's right.
And if you're not on the menu, you have to build a new table. So yeah, grateful to be at the table. Yeah. Regardless.
Grateful to have you at the table as part of the team.
Thanks.
Awesome. So that's it. That wraps up our 2-part mini-series on the workshops on the regulation of space activities and technologies. I hope that you got a lot out of listening to the different range of experts and perspectives that we have, that we are very honoured and privileged to be able to interact with. And do keep an eye out for the outputs we have on WRegSAT on our website, spacegovcentre.org. Thanks for listening. The Australasian Centre for Space Governance is a not-for-profit association. We are a transdisciplinary hub, bridging expertise in space law, policy, history, political and social sciences to advocate and shape perspectives on responsible space governance, ensuring that space supports well-being, prosperity and sustainability for current and future generations across the Asia-Pacific. The Space Matters podcast is supported by research funds of the Australasian Centre for Space Governance and is produced by Daniel McKay. You can find out more about today's guest in our show notes, and you can follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and Instagram. Watch this podcast video on YouTube or listen on your favourite podcasting platform.